Hi, everyone. Welcome to another confined edition of The World This Week. The World This Week in partnership with The Daily Beast. The Daily Beast foreign editor Christopher Dickey is with us. We're headed into week 7, Christopher. How do you feel?
Good. I was just thinking this morning, you know how the French talk about the nostalgie de la guerre, nostalgia for the war? I suspect some of us will feel nostalgia for the plague at some point. Because in fact, it doesn't feel terrible most of the time if you don't have to deal on the front lines with the hospitals.
Yeah, or if you're not crammed into a teeny tiny apartment. Let's ask Reem Mumtaz, who's also in the French capital, Paris correspondent for Politico. How's confinement going?
Listen, it's fine. I mean, you get used to it, I think. But it is getting long, and I am looking forward to getting back to practicing journalism the way it was supposed to be, which is in person and not just on the phone.
He's got one foot in, one foot out. Jamil Shadeh is with us, columnist for Brazilian news website UOL. You're in Geneva, which is more relaxed than here, but also partially in lockdown.
Exactly. In fact, the city has this dual situation, but the fact that WHO and other institutions are here, trust me, it has not been a very quiet quarantine, that's for sure.
All right. And then there's the one panelist that the rest of us can really resent. That's Donald Kirk. He's the sole correspondent for the Daily Beast. South Korea, where there's no confinement at all. We'll talk about that in a moment. How are you?
I'm good. I was out and about today. It's a beautiful day in Seoul, and people are out and about. I was quarantined for 2 weeks after getting here, but I got out of house arrest or quarantine a few days ago, and life appears pretty normal here.
Right. We're going to ask you about that because you're the first person I know who's been actively contact traced. We'll ask you about that in a moment. Thanks so much for being with us, Don. Deconfinement here in France, May 11th is the date when it's due to start. It's beginning in Germany this coming Sunday. It's going to be the same story in Spain. And again, it's going to happen in increments, says the Prime Minister.
La transición hacia esa nueva normalidad no avanzará al mismo ritmo en toda España, ni siquiera en cada una de las comunidades autónomas. El inicio de la fase 1, el tránsito a la fase 2 y de esta a la fase 3 y la desescalada total no serán uniformes en consecuencia en todo el territorio.
There's actually 5 levels because there's a level 0 in Spain of deconfinement. And Reem Mumtaz, that level 0 includes the reopening of barbershops and hairdressers. We never thought what an essential service that would seem.
Yeah, I think most of us are really looking forward to being able to go back to the hairdresser, to the people who, pluck our eyebrows and do our nails. Although, kidding aside, I mean, I think it's obviously not the biggest of our concerns. I think the big questions, at least in France, that are being asked are about, how to safely go back to school with the children going back there. Is everyone going to have enough masks? How do we get around cities? Is public transport going to be an option? Are we all going to have to get on bikes? These are the more important issues, of course, after making sure that the healthcare system, continues not to be overwhelmed.
The healthcare system not to be overwhelmed. By the way, not the most auspicious of starts, because in France, too, they're going to try to do it in increments. There was a map put out for the first time of what the map of France would look like for increments. But there's a mistake on it. In fact, there's 3 mistakes on it. One of the departments in Corsica should be in green, not in red. Same in that southwestern department of the Lot, and the Gers shouldn't be in red either. The government's apologized for that. Not the most auspicious of starts, Christopher Dickey.
No, and I think, France has been a little bit disappointing. They've been falling behind in tests. They have been really awkward in their response many times. On the other hand, they've been much more truthful with the public than, for instance, the American government in the early stages of the plague. And it's too bad about the map.
You're calling it the plague.
Easily rectified. Oh, well, the plague, the coronavirus pandemic, whatever we want to take it. I think the plague is a good name for it. It's not the bubonic plague, but it is a plague. And in fact, it's as disastrous as almost any disease, certainly any disease in this century, and virtually any disease in the last century.
Reem was mentioning all those different issues there where there's still a lot of arbitration to come. Perhaps the most pressing in this country, Christopher, is schools, because some schools are going to open, others are not. They're not sure how it's going to work. Is it really worth it, seeing as the end of the school year is, well, only a month and a half away?
Well, they're going to open the schools, the lowest age group schools, the maternelle, the nursery schools, the early elementary stages first, because basically people who are working can't leave those children at home. So having the children in school will make it easier for people to get back on the job. But once you get up to the level of teenagers, I don't think that those schools will open again until the fall. They're going to feel their way forward, but there's really no reason for them to.
Jamil Shadeh, more about what it's like where you are in Switzerland in terms of how far along you are.
Yeah, in fact, Switzerland will reopen, at least some of the cantons will reopen their schools on the 11th of May. There's, as Spain, as other countries, a very thorough plan of, let's say, transition. Now, what it makes very interesting is the fact that Switzerland at the same time is the headquarters of WHO, and many of the WHO officials obviously not only live, but have their children in schools here. So there's a mix of what happens in the city of Geneva and what happens inside WHO itself. WHO has been alerting for some time, but it increased their alert this week, insisting on the fact that you cannot substitute the quarantine or the restrictions for nothing. You have to have a plan. You have to have something very detailed. Otherwise, as they put it, there is a very big chance that you would see a surge in number of cases. Now, there are quite a lot of instructions, let's say, for these transitions to be made. But the main one is the ability to test and to isolate eventual cases. This in Switzerland has been an issue in the beginning. Switzerland had decided in the beginning only to test those who are in a more vulnerable situation and the risk groups. It changed a little bit the let's say the strategy during the height of the pandemic. Let's see. WHO itself says no one exactly knows what is going to happen when the transitions are, let's say, established.
Testing is a sore subject here in France, what with 4 times more that have been conducted so far in neighboring Germany. And that is going to be a key element as we head towards deconfinement on May 11th. I think Jamil made an important point, Donald Kirk, which is you can't substitute lockdown, nothing for a lockdown. And certainly in South Korea, they haven't been sitting idle, and you've experienced it firsthand. You said you came back from the United States and you were contact traced. Describe what that entails.
Well, the first thing was that they put me in a facility, a youth center, which had been converted into a place for new arrivals for 24 hours while awaiting the result of the test that they gave me at the airport, which luckily came back negative. And then I had to go to my place here, my modest house here, and I have to stay here. Now, it's not exactly a torturous experience. My wife is here and her sister's here, and it's been okay. But I got out a few days ago. Now, while I was
hang on a second, Don. You tested negative. You got the test, first of all. You tested negative. And yet you still had to spend 14 days in quarantine?
Absolutely, because this disease can fester within you for 14 days, emerging any time, as so it's said. So therefore, here I was in quarantine for 14 days at home here, and twice a day, a very nice woman from the district office called me every day and asked how I was and asked if I'd had any headaches or coughs or whatever. And on top of that, I had a nifty app placed in my phone, my mobile at the airport. And they asked for a self-diagnosis every day, in which they said, have you had any coughs, any headaches, any fevers? They asked you to give your temperature. I don't actually have a thermometer, But I guess and I go by the Western or the English or the American temperature system, which is 98.6 normal. But I'm told that 37 is the normal in the rest of the world. And so I always put down 37 every day since I didn't feel any fever, and nor did I take my temperature. But anyway, this all ended.
And that app that got in your phone, was that mandatory? You had to put it in?
Oh, absolutely. Before you even go through immigration at the airport, before you do anything, people in garbed in white hazmat suits, head to toe, stop you. They're perfectly courteous about it. Don't get me wrong, and they put this app in my phone, and then I go through immigration and customs, come out the airport thinking, well, now I'll go home, and no, I'm not going home because there's soldiers there. Again, not rude or anything like that, but just simply directing me to where you take the test. So they give you this rather unpleasant test. I don't know how many of you have had this test, but they stick a tiny little stick way up in one of your nostrils. So it's rather unpleasant. And another stick way down your throat. And then you have to get on a bus to this youth facility, which was quite far, an hour and a half, 90-minute ride south of Seoul. And you spend the night there, and you're very much confined to this room. The meals are placed outside the room. There's an announcement on the loudspeaker saying the meal will be ready in 5 minutes. And then you open the door, nobody's in the corridor, and you get your meal. It was very well regimented, very, very, very strict. And I don't have any real criticism of it, because the proof of the validity of this whole program, not just this, but a whole lot of other measures, is that there have been far fewer cases here than in other countries. Korea was hit pretty hard at first around the city of Daegu, southeast of Seoul, where members of a religious sect came back carrying the virus from Wuhan. And that.
But since they managed to flatten the curve, and we've seen the last 3 days. There was Wednesday, 0 new cases in South Korea. Thursday, 0 new cases. I believe there were 9 new cases this Friday. Nonetheless, the numbers are very low. And let me bring in Christopher Dickey on this. Chris, that contact tracing that Don's just described, that's quite an endeavor.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not sure if Don actually had contact tracing in the sense that everybody he met also had to be registered and tracked, but it certainly sounds like extreme measures of quarantine for anybody coming into the country. And Don, now I know I didn't hear from you for so long.
Right. But here's a wrinkle on the whole thing. Every now and then your phone buzzes, and you look at your phone, what's going on here, and you see the words emergency alert. And then written in Korean beneath emergency alert is a notice that somebody somewhere in your ward has been diagnosed with the virus. Or there's a notice that you should be sure to wear your face masks and keep a socially distant measurement from people around you. But I think that they can find you if you go out when you're in quarantine, and if you go to a coffee shop, I think they can. I'm quite sure they can trace you via your cell phone. There have been cases of people who suffered quite heavy fines and were kicked out of the country for violating quarantine.
Let me bring in Reem Mumtaz on this. Reem, this is it's been a tough week for Europe when it comes to this issue of tracking apps. The Germans parting way with most of the rest of the continent. The French, who, in the speech by the Prime Minister on Tuesday, effectively admitted that their tracking apps are nowhere near ready. Your reaction to what you've heard from Don?
It's going to be really difficult, I think, to put that in place in Europe, just because there are, I think, people in Europe don't really love sort of sharing that level of information with the government. There are privacy concerns. And generally, there's a really high level, at least in France, of sort of suspicion, toward the government. There isn't a very high level of trust with the government. And so at the beginning, they wanted to have this app, discuss it in Parliament, but not hold a vote. Then when parliamentarians were like, what are you talking about? We actually need to vote on this. They decided, okay, possibly will do the vote. Then they changed course. The prime minister decided to present his sort of lockdown exit plan in parliament, hold a vote on that, but not hold a vote on the contact tracing because things aren't ready yet. So there's a lot of sort of, it's in fits and starts, and they're trying to figure things out. I think we also have to be a bit fair with governments. At least here, in Korea or in China, they've had to deal with these kinds of epidemics before. At least they have more experience with dealing with these sorts of things. The people are better equipped. They have masks, etc. They know when to wear them, how to wear them. In Europe, we're just discovering this. And, in addition to the fact that this virus is completely new, scientists around the world are working to continue to figure out, how does it behave? How does immunity work? If once you get it, are you immune or not? How long are you immune? So I think there are some things we can criticize, but we should also accept that there's a huge level of uncertainty that most governments are having to deal with, and sort of make decisions in light of that, and then adjust as they learn new information.
Yeah, this pandemic, this scale of pandemic is very new to most countries. While Europe is beginning to talk about deconfinement, as we've said, the numbers are growing drastically worse in Brazil, which could be the new planet's coronavirus hotspot, what with the number of deaths there now surpassing that of China this week. Nonetheless, there are supporters of President Bolsonaro who are saying, let's reopen the country.
Precisamos trabalhar. O país está quebrado. Estão usando a doença, o coronavírus, na política.
Jamil Shadeh, is this effectively the same culture war that's playing out in the US that's happening in Brazil?
Yeah, probably this is a tropical version of what we see in the US as well. The fact is that most of these protests are not completely, let's say, popular in terms of, it's not something that just comes out of the population itself. President Bolsonaro himself attended some of these demonstrations. He retweeted some of the images of these events. Thus, there is a suspicion, a very high suspicion, that this could be even organized or at least incentivized by the government itself, the federal government. Obviously, Brazil has different layers of government. The big question is whether the government is aware of the dimension that this will cause politically, even for the government. What we've seen today, as you said, numbers surpassing those of China in terms of death, but now also in terms of transmission, also being in a very, very difficult position. The government claims that it has to reopen the economy, otherwise the collapse will be a very strong one. However, and this is the element that is quite worrying, there is no such a thing as a plan in terms of tracing, isolating, testing people in a reasonable amount of numbers. So in many ways, you see a very vulnerable situation in the country.
We're seeing independent initiatives in various places and trying to deal with it. We spoke to one virologist in Sao Paulo earlier this week. France 24's team in Brazil went to Rio's largest favela and there saw working class people who are those essential care workers who have no other option but to go to work. If they want to be tested, in most instances, if they don't have help from an NGO, our reporters finding out that that test costs somewhere around the equivalent of $50 in most cases. However, they did meet with a medical team at the University of Rio, which is trying its best to come up with a cheaper testing process.
Se der tudo certo, a gente pode fazer teste nesse formato. Ó. Então, ó, você consegue ver se você tem IgG ou IgM. Já foi infectada no Brasil, está muito subestimado. Alguns trabalhos na USP de São Paulo mostram de 10 a 20 vezes subestimado. A gente acha que pode ser até mais.
10 to 20 times more, Jamil Shad?
Yes, these are numbers that have been circulating by very respected universities. The situation is not an easy one. Obviously, the situation is very different from the one in Europe, where you can actually stay at home. The problem in the periphery of these big cities, São Paulo, Rio, but many others, is that basically you don't have a home to stay. In many of the cases, you don't have tap water, you don't have shelter in some of these cases. And obviously, your income depends on you leaving your house absolutely every day. Now, it's a very big challenge. It doesn't justify what the government is doing. Obviously, the response would have to be a much stronger response, both in terms of health, but also socially. And the drama today in Brazil is that you don't have neither the health response nor the social response at the level that it should. So very worrying days, especially the next week should be a very complicated week as well. Even President Trump, for the last 3 days, have been mentioning how difficult the situation is in Brazil. But I would say the highest alert is the fact that the federal government still has a position of denial towards the disease itself. It's a very complicated setting, one that one cannot predict what will happen in the coming weeks, I would say.
And yet there's blowback. Christopher Dickey, 20 of Brazil's 27 state governors are taking the initiative on this and defying the federal government. Does that sound familiar?
Well, it does sound familiar, but I think especially in a country like Brazil, where you have these enormous slums, these favelas, you not only have the question of state governments taking the initiative, you also have a question of organized crime taking the initiative. They're basically trying to shut down certain areas, not only so they can operate more effectively, but so that they can claim responsibility for keeping people alive. It's a terrible situation when the government essentially abdicates its responsibility for protecting the people and the citizens of its country. And that's essentially what Bolsonaro has done in Brazil. And for a while, it's what Donald Trump was doing in the United States. And the results we see, in the United States, we're up above 64,000 people have died so far from this disease, and many more will die before it's over.
And the Daily Beast has been reporting, Christopher, on the fact that those that have prematurely tried to exit lockdown, well, we've already seen what the results of that's been.
Yes, well, I mean, when you exit lockdown, when the federal guidelines, such as they are, say that you're not supposed to start exiting the lockdown until you've gone through 14 days of declining infections, and every state that's opening up failed to pass that test, but they're doing it anyway. And you've got lots of people who are saying, well, I had to get back to work, I would starve. No, they probably wouldn't starve, it would be difficult. But I don't think those people really realize what it's been like on the front lines in the hospitals. And I don't think they really realize what it's going to be like when they lose their grandparents, when they lose friends who have asthma or other kinds of health complications, and when they lose people who just got sick with COVID-19 and died. When you start to lose tens of thousands and then hundreds of thousands of people in a pandemic or a plague, if you will, then people will notice, but it's too late. Right now, they're being told what they can do to prevent that from happening. To some extent, it has been prevented. If they keep opening up, it won't be prevented, and it will be too late to save the lives of all those people that will be lost.
Jamil Shade, before we move on, just this comment, the president of Brazil in an interview with Radio Guaíba said that they should reopen the football season. Footballers, if infected with the virus, he says, have a small chance of dying. That's because of their physical state, because they are athletes. Your reaction?
Yeah, this thesis of being an athlete has been used by Bolsonaro since the beginning of the crisis, when he himself said, I'm a former athlete, thus I'm not worried about this. WHO and many other institutions obviously deny any link between being an athlete and surviving the coronavirus. But Bolsonaro goes much beyond the element of the athlete itself. He actually said this week as well, when he was asked about the 5,000 deaths, the response was, "So what?" That was his official response to the question. When we talk about football, obviously you're talking about the players, yes, about an important part of the economy, yes, but you're also trying to give a signal to society saying, look, everything is back to normal. Even our football is back. So why are you worried? Why are you still staying at home? So it is something very symbolic that he's using for this. Now, a very good answer came from Rai, the brother of Socrates. He used to play for PSG in the 90s. He's now one of the directors of the São Paulo football team. And he said, we won't
Socrates, who we should tell our viewers who aren't soccer fans, was a legendary Brazilian football player and a medical doctor.
Exactly. And his brother, his younger brother, Rai, which played also in the national team, just yesterday in an interview said, no, we're not going back, and Bolsonaro needs to renounce. I mean, this is coming from a football player, head of one of the largest teams in the country, basically denying this path as obviously a reasonable path. Bolsonaro also is becoming increasingly isolated, as you've mentioned, governors, but also parliamentarians. Obviously, you have civil society, you have the UN itself criticizing and claiming Bolsonaro's policies are irresponsible. And at the same time, you have a situation where you have the medical community questioning him in a very strong way. To complete the setting, which is absolutely incredible, you have the fact that the health minister was fired because he was trying to follow WHO recommendations.
So you have those that are denying what's going on, and then you have those blaming it on others. The latest pronouncements by Donald Trump have raised eyebrows yet again, contradicting his own intelligence services. Haxie Myers-Belkin has more.
First, he accused China of covering up the severity of the outbreak in its early stages. Now, open speculation from the US president that COVID-19 originated in a Chinese lab and was then released into the world.
Have you seen anything at this point that gives you a high degree of confidence that the Wuhan Institute of Virology was the origin of this virus?
Yes, I have. Yes, I have.
What proof that was, Trump wouldn't say.
Whether it started off as a mistake and then they made another one, or did somebody do something on purpose? That's a hard question for them to answer.
Trump's latest comments contradicted an earlier communiqué from US spy agencies, which said they were still investigating the idea that the new coronavirus was the result of a laboratory accident. Although they did say they came down firmly on the side of the scientific consensus that COVID-19 was not man-made or genetically modified. China, for its part, strenuously denies claims the virus originated in a lab. Beijing's propaganda machine instead putting forward a message of China as the responsible party in the face of this pandemic, sharing its scientific knowledge and medical supplies with the world.
We discovered a new virus.
One video published by a Chinese government-affiliated news site, a case in point. As China raises the alarm and swiftly enacts a lockdown, the US, represented by Lady Liberty, has only insults and incredulity.
Reem Momtaz, that video, by the way, the Lego video that we just saw, it's on the Twitter account of the Chinese embassy here in Paris.
Yes, you're right to point out the Chinese embassy in Paris, because they've been at the tip of the spear of Chinese propaganda and disinformation. We should say disinformation, if not lies, campaign, around the world, targeting not just the US, and obviously there is a US-China issue going on and an underlying clash. but also targeting Europe and trying to undermine the cohesion of the EU bloc, attacking the way various countries handled the epidemic. I don't know if you saw in this particular Lego-inspired, although I'm not sure Lego actually gave permission for them to use their own animation. I don't know if you saw, but at one point I thought there was quite an offensive part that showed the Leaning Tower of Pisa kind of going down with a weird, almost kind of ridiculing sound, as if to make fun of the hardship that Italy went through. But beyond that, to go back to sort of the Chinese embassy here, they've been posting a series of so-called anonymous blog posts. But as we know, nothing gets published on the website of the Chinese embassy without the oversight of the ambassador. And in fact, the ambassador to France is quite an interesting character. He sort of rose to international fame when he was at the heart of a diplomatic spat between Canada and China last year, actually, in his last year of being ambassador to Canada. And then he was sent to France, and he's been really at the forefront of their campaign. And to talk about this particular video that came out, I mean, there's no question that the way US President Donald Trump has handled the entire epidemic is extremely problematic, that he has made false statements about the epidemic and the science behind it. But that is not to say that this video by the Chinese is any closer to the truth than anything Donald Trump has said.
Enough there to anger the United States, enough to, as you say, to anger Italy, Denmark, because it is Lego is Danish after all. Nonetheless, Politico is reporting that earlier this week, the EU on the slide watered down critical remarks of China.
Yes, so Politico's playbook, Brussels playbook, broke the story last Monday when we got a copy of an internal EEAS, so the European External Action Service, report that they were preparing to release. It was supposed to get released Monday or Tuesday. It was about the disinformation and propaganda campaigns, not just by China, by the way, but also Russia and other actors. And then we kept waiting for the report to be released. It never came until Friday. And on Friday, it came out, and the language regarding China was indeed changed and was indeed made less strong, watered down. And there were a lot of questions raised by the Brussels sort of journalists who were there. And, the EEAS press service tried to undermine, there's no other way, they tried to smear Politico by saying that we were spreading disinformation, and then they had to apologize to us. And then their line of defense was that there's always two versions of these reports, one for internal use and one for external use, and that they really didn't bow to pressure, but that it's normal in diplomatic relations for a country to try to weigh in and give its point of view. And I want to just circle back to the issue related to where and how this virus started and where it originated and how it spread. I think there's a bit of confusion in the way we're all sort of commenting on it. People who are asking for an investigation into whether this may have been a leak out of the lab aren't necessarily saying that it was man-made in the lab. As we know, some of these labs are made to study these kinds of viruses that are naturally occurring. So that's the question that no one has been able to answer so far. Is this a naturally occurring virus that was under study in one of those labs, and then there was an accident and it leaked? We don't know yet.
Chris Verdicki?
Well, I think that that Reem is exactly right. I don't think we know that yet. But on the other hand, it's not at all beyond the realm of possibility that what's called the wet market in Wuhan, where people did buy and eat all kinds of wild animals, was the original source. The original tracing of the disease all seemed to go back to that market. The disease exploded when, in fact, the Chinese government, particularly the local government in Wuhan and Hubei province, tried to cover all this up, tried to pretend there was no issue. and it pulled 40,000 people together for a vast potluck dinner, which then, as we know, was a perfect case of a cluster that exploded through the region. So wherever the first hint of the virus was, whether it escaped from the lab to the market, whether it was in the market, the error there was in having that enormous potluck dinner, bringing all those people together when it was already known that the disease had begun to spread. And that's what we've seen again and again. It's what we saw even here in Europe.
And then covering up for almost a
Mhm.
month, you know, the information that they had. I
Yeah.
mean, the Chinese government claims that it was on the up and up, that it was the one that actually informed the WHO, but the WHO, in a press statement and in a press conference 2 days ago, said that it was the one that requested information from China on December 31st to get whatever information they had on the virus then. And I think this is the issue, which is, instead of being so defensive, why not say, listen, this is all the information we have so far. We all of humanity has a shared interest in figuring out how this started and how it spread, so that we can prevent it from happening again. I mean, that would be, it seems, a reasonable position to take.
All right, and something, of course, we'll continue to talk about. Just before we go, because we're running a little short on time, so much to talk about. Dunkirk, since April 13th, the leader of North Korea has not been seen in public. This time last week, the rumor mill was in full overdrive. The South Korea's government, where you are, stating there's no reason to think that anything bad has happened to Kim Jong Un. Your latest piece in the Daily Beast, nonetheless, you look at different scenarios. Everything is still possible, and you take a particularly close look at the role that's been played by his 34-year-old younger sister.
Right. By the way, I don't think that the South Korean government is any longer saying that, well, nothing bad has happened. I haven't heard them saying that for 2 or 3 days. But there certainly are a lot of scenarios, and the longer he vanishes from view, the more likely it is that he's not doing well. Now, how badly he's doing is another matter, but he doesn't seem to be doing well, and there's a whole lot of silence from North Korea. So obviously, there's a lot.
Could he just be lying low because maybe somebody in his entourage caught COVID-19, that he's paranoid and wants to stay away from the limelight?
He could be lying low like that, but on the other hand, if he's worried about that, they could still have a TV camera zeroing on him, and he can still make statements and still comment and still issue pronouncements. He hasn't done any of that. His voice has not been heard. He's not been seen in any way since August 11th was the meeting of the Politburo, where he gave a speech urging for stronger measures against the virus. And then I think he did appear on the 12th at an Air Force thing, and he hasn't been seen since. So it's not looking good for him. That's for sure. And the whole question is who might succeed him. His younger sister, Kim Yo-jong, is talked about a lot because she has the so-called bloodline, the proper bloodline, and she's been with him a lot, and a lot of trips he's made to Beijing. She was with him to South Korea for the Pyeongchang Olympics in 2018, and she's also issued statements in her own name this year, criticizing South Korea's President Moon for being too close to the U.S. and not doing what he should do to bring about reconciliation, and also talking rather nicely and politely to President Trump. So she's an increasing figure. However, there are a couple of others who might also be in the running. It's very interesting. We can only speculate. We have to speculate about his condition and about what's going on politically, and it's all speculation.
All speculation at this point, and yeah, as you say, and if Kim's does have health issues, and if they are linked to his weight, well, then perhaps he should look away for this final item of ours, which is this call by the Belgians on citizens to do their patriotic duty and eat more chips, more pommes frites, fries, which they claim are not French, but Belgian. The head of the Belgian Potato Growers Association, its Secretary General, issuing the plea.
We know that Belgians like their fries. It's intangible heritage stuff, our fry culture. So we asked the Belgians to consume an extra portion of fries now to allow us to process more potatoes and to avoid food waste.
Christopher Dickey, will you, out of solidarity with the Belgians, help yourself to an extra portion of frites?
Yes, with lots of mayonnaise on top of it, the way they eat it.
By the way, on a more serious note, there's a real issue of stocks that are full. The French are asking their citizens to eat more cheese. Italian wine is overflowing. Beef is a big problem.
Well, that's true. And we see the same thing in the United States. Farmers are in trouble because they're not able to, for one reason or another, get their goods to market, either because there's a glut in the market, or in the United States, because the meatpacking plants have been shut down by coronavirus. President Trump has ordered them to stay open, even though people are dying in the assembly line. So you've got this situation where food is necessary to everybody. It's also one of the things here in Europe, I can testify to this myself, that makes this lockdown endurable. People are cooking at home. They are eating at home. And I think people are eating very well, but they're not eating in the quantities that they used to, particularly when restaurants were serving hundreds and thousands of meals a day. So, you know, farmers are in trouble, and they're always in trouble in Europe and in the United States, but we'll get through this one way or the other. And in the meantime, I'm looking forward to dinner again tonight.
Okay, we will leave it there. Christopher Dickey, I want to thank you so much for joining us. Rim Momtaz was also with us from the French capital. Jamil Shadeh, who is with us from Geneva. Don Kirk in Seoul, South Korea. Thank you for joining us here in The World This Week. There's more on our website, france24.com. You can also podcast the show or follow us on our YouTube channel. There's more to come right here on France 24. Bye for now.